The past remembers things that engineering drawings forget. That's what Earl Duchamp's father used to say, standing on the dock in the blue-gray hour before a Gulf Coast sunrise, watching the bars shift in the mouth of Calcasieu past the way other men watched weather. He said the past kept its own records, that if you learned to read the water at the threshold, the color where it changed, the pull where the current argued with itself, the way the bar built on one side and dropped on the other, you'd know things that no survey vessel could tell you. Earl was 71 years old. He had been reading the past his whole working life. He'd spent 34 years as a bar pilot on Calcasieu Pass in southwest Louisiana, guiding tankers and cargo ships through the shallow, perpetually shifting threshold between the river and the open Gulf. Bar piloting was different from harbor work. You read it in real time, from the wheelhouse, from the color of the water, from the way the bow felt in the current. You developed a vocabulary that had no written form. It lived in your hands on the wheel and in the way you knew, before the depth sounder confirmed it, that the bar had moved 2 feet shallower since the last transit. Now he lived in a small house above the tide line in Cameron Parish, half a mile from the pass. The house had a porch that faced west toward the Gulf, and he sat on it most mornings with coffee and his notebooks, watching the birds. He kept his piloting notebooks in a wooden cabinet in the kitchen, 34 years of them, each dated on the spine in black marker. Transit records, bar readings, current notations, weather conditions, bottom observations taken by instinct and experience at the same stations, season after season. The kind of data that doesn't appear in hydrographic surveys, because nobody thought to ask the man who crossed the bar 6 times a day for 3 decades. His father's notebooks were in the same cabinet, a different handwriting, smaller and more deliberate, but the same categories. Going back to 1961, Earl had started his own notebooks the year he earned his pilot's license. His father had handed him a blank one and said, "Write down what you notice, not what you expect. Those are different things, and the difference will matter more than you think." He still wrote in one every week, even in retirement. His grandson, Marcus, was 10 and visited on weekends. He had recently started asking what the numbers meant. The first thing Earl noticed was the pelicans. Not their absence, their movement. The brown pelicans that had nested on the spoil island in the middle of the pass had used the western nesting site without interruption for as long as Earl had been watching. His father's notebooks mentioned them from the first volume. The western face of the island, sheltered from the dominant southwest wind, built up with coarse shell substrate over decades, was where the pelicans went every spring without variation or apparent deliberation, the way water finds its level. In the spring of Earl's 68th year, he noticed that a handful of nesting pairs had moved to the eastern face. He noted it in his log without attaching significance. Some things changed for reasons that clarified themselves later. He counted 7 pairs on the eastern face, 42 on the western. He wrote it down. The following spring, the eastern count was 19. The western had dropped to 31. He went back to his father's notebooks and looked for any mention of this pattern. He found nothing. In 60 years of accumulated observation, the pelicans had never moved, not after hurricanes, not after the oil spill, not after any of the events that had reshaped the pass and the communities around it. Something was different. He wrote it down. Then he went to make breakfast and tried not to think about it too much, because he had been wrong before and the past didn't reward impatience. That wasn't the part that kept him awake at night. The part that kept him awake came in late autumn of that second year, when he walked the shoreline below his house after low tide and saw what the bar was doing. The bar at the mouth of Calcasieu Pass was not a fixed feature. It built and shifted with the seasons, with storm events, with changes in the river sediment load, with a slow negotiation between fresh water and salt that the pass had been conducting for as long as the river had been finding the Gulf. Earl understood its moods the way a musician understands an instrument, not by knowing what it would do, but by knowing what it was capable of. What he saw that autumn was asymmetry. The western side of the bar was building, accumulating. The shoal that always flanked the navigation channel on the western edge had extended itself seaward by what Earl's eye estimated at 30 feet, maybe more. The eastern side showed no corresponding growth. The bar was leaning. He drove to the public boat ramp and waded the shallows with his depth rod, the same aluminum pole he had used for unofficial soundings throughout his career, and confirmed what his eye had already told him. The western shoal was shallower than it should have been by 18 inches on average. The eastern approach was unchanged. He went home and pulled out his notebooks. What asymmetric bar growth on the western side meant, in the vocabulary he had spent 3 decades developing, was that the dominant current had shifted. The bar built on the side the current was moving away from. If the western shoal was accreting, the current had swung east. The Talveg, the deepest thread the channel, had been migrating eastward, slowly, quietly, in the way that these things always moved, patient and invisible and indifferent to the surveys taken months or years ago. He looked at the pelican data again. The eastern face of the spoil island. The birds had moved east. They responded to substrate change. The ground beneath the nesting site had to be stable, had to be accreting rather than eroding. The pelicans had found the accreting side of the island. The accreting side was east. The pass was moving east. He sat with that for 2 weeks before he said anything to anyone. The Shipping Consortium's announcement came in January. Earl read it in the local paper and then read it again. The Maritime Authority of Louisiana, in partnership with a commercial consortium operating LNG tanker traffic through Calcasieu Pass, had received federal approval to relocate and permanently deepen the main navigation channel. The new channel alignment would be shifted east of the existing corridor and hardened with engineer revetment, armored bank protection, to hold it in its new position permanently. The project was designed to accommodate the next generation of LNG carriers, vessels deeper and wider than anything currently transiting the pass. The economic projections were substantial. The permits were in order. Construction was scheduled to begin the following autumn. Earl put the newspaper down on the kitchen table. He opened his notebook to the Pelican counts. He opened his father's 1964 notebook to the bar observations from that year. He set them beside each other and looked at them for a long time. The new channel alignment was east of the existing corridor. The pass had been migrating east on its own for at least 2 years. What the consortium proposed was to lock the channel into the position the pass was already moving toward, and then prevent it from continuing to move. Hardened revetment didn't flex. It held, and a pass that could not migrate would stop being a pass in the way that word had meaning in the vocabulary Earl had spent his life learning. He pulled out his father's 1964 notebook and found the entry from March of that year. His father had documented a bar shift. Significant, the same asymmetric western accretion that Earl was seeing now. He had written, bar leaning west to east. Current swung. Birds moved east on the island. Watched it for 2 months. Passed through on its own by November. Pass corrected. 2 months of observation. Then self-correction. The pass had done this before. It had always done this before. But this time, if the revetment went in, it couldn't do it again. He made a phone call to the Maritime Authority. The public comment session was held on a Tuesday evening in Lake Charles, in a meeting room at the port offices. There were 40 people in attendance. Most of them were in favor of the project. The economic argument was not a small one. Jobs, infrastructure, long-term revenue for a parish that had been hollowed out by storms and oil cycles and the slow departure of everything that kept young people from leaving. Earl understood that. He had lived in Cameron Parish his whole life. He brought his notebooks, his father's 1964 volume, his own records of the Pelican counts, the bar soundings, the current notations going back to his retirement. He had organized them the night before the way his father had taught him. Start with what you observed, not with what you concluded. Let the evidence arrive before the theory. The Maritime Authority's lead hydrologist was a careful man named Terode. He listened without interrupting. When Earl finished, Terode said the pelican data was interesting, but that nesting behavior was influenced by predator pressure, vegetation changes, and intercolony dynamics, none of which could be ruled out. He said the bar asymmetry was within the range of seasonal variation in the authority's monitoring data. The project's channel design had been developed over 4 years of hydrographic surveys and peer review by 3 independent firms. He was not dismissive. He was a man who believed in his instruments, and his instruments were good. Earl asked one question. He asked whether the hydrological model accounted for the pass's historical migration cycle, the long period oscillation between east and west that his father's records documented across 60 years. Terode said the model used 15 years of survey data. which was a standard baseline for this class of project. Earl nodded. 15 years was less than half of one migration cycle. The model was accurate. It simply wasn't old enough. He drove home and wrote one entry in his notebook. January 14th, public comment session. Data presented. Migration cycle, not in their model. Revetment proceeds as planned. Watch the island. He closed the notebook. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. Marcus came on Saturday. He was 10 and methodical in a way that certain children are, the ones who inherit a habit of attention without being taught it directly. He had been coming to Earl's house most weekends for 2 years, and somewhere in the second year, he had started bringing a small green notebook and writing down the pelican counts from a porch. Earl had never asked him to. Marcus had simply noticed that his grandfather looked at the island every morning, and that the looking involved counting, and that the counting involved writing, and so he had started doing the same. He had watched it happen the way you watch something good occur, without wanting to interrupt it. The Saturday after the public comment session, Marcus counted 38 pelicans on the eastern face and only 4 on the western. Earl wrote down the same numbers in his own notebook. Then he sat with his coffee and looked at the island for a long time. Construction began in October. The dredging vessels arrived first. 2 large cutterhead dredges had anchored in the pass and began working the new channel alignment. The sound carried to Earl's porch at night, a low mechanical rhythm that was different from the engines of the tankers he had spent his career guiding through the same water. He wrote in his notebook. In November, he noticed the spoil island was changing shape, not dramatically, but the northern end, closest to the main dredging operation, was showing erosion marks that had not been there before. Small cuts in the substrate, the kind of thing that could be attributed to wake turbulence or to seasonal current variation, or to nothing in particular. He photographed it and taped the photos into the notebook. He told himself he might be wrong. He had been wrong before. The past did not always announce its intentions clearly, and he was reading from a distance now, not from a wheelhouse with 30 years of feel in his hands. He decided to wait. The waiting was the hardest part, not because he was certain he was right, but because he was not certain he was right, and the uncertainty felt different in retirement. On the water, uncertainty was a condition you worked in. You made the best call you could and lived with the outcome. In retirement, it had no outlet. It just sat with you on the porch. He called a marine biologist he had known for years, a woman named Dr. Celestine Arsenault from LSU's Coastal Studies program, who had spent 2 decades researching Louisiana's barrier coast sediment dynamics. He described the pelican shift, the bar asymmetry, the erosion marks, his father's 1964 entry. She said the pelican data was the most interesting part. Pelicans were more sensitive to substrate instability than almost any other colonial nesting species on the Gulf Coast. Their nesting site selection was a real-time geotechnical assessment performed by a species that had been making that assessment in these waters for a very long time. She would like to see the notebooks. She drove out the following weekend. She spent 4 hours at Earl's kitchen table with the notebooks spread around her. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the pelican count data Marcus had been recording. Earl had laid it out separately, the boy's careful handwriting in the green notebook, and then at Earl's matching entries. The migration cycle his father had documented was real, she said. 60 years of bar data showing 2 complete east-west oscillations, each self-correcting, each driven by the same hydraulic dynamics that still govern the pass. The engineering model had used 15 years of data, not even half a cycle. The hardened revetment would interrupt the cycle at its eastward phase and hold it there permanently. What happened to a pass when you stopped its migration was not well studied, but the sediment dynamics were not complicated to predict. The adjacent wetlands received their sediment replenishment from the cycle. Each time the channel swung, it dropped material in the places it was vacating, feeding the marsh, fixed the channel permanently, and those wetlands stopped receiving sediment. In Louisiana, wetland subsidence was not a theoretical concern. Earl asked how long before anyone would see it. 5 years for the first measurements, she said. 10 before it became undeniable. 15 before the federal remediation threshold would be crossed. And then, the spoil island is already showing it. The northern erosion is not from wake turbulence. That substrate has been destabilized. The sediment cycle that built it and maintained it has been interrupted. Earl looked out the window at the island. He thought about Marcus's notebook. The boy had been counting since he was 8. He had 2 years of baseline pelican data that predated the construction, data that no federal review had asked for because no federal review had known it existed. He asked Dr. Arsenault if the pelican count data would matter in a regulatory context. She said it would matter very much. If the spoil island erosion triggered review under the Coastal Zone Management Act, pre-construction nesting baseline data would be exactly what a federal wildlife biologist would need. He went to the cabinet and found Marcus's green notebook and put it on the table beside his own. The spoil island erosion accelerated in the second year. Dr. Arsenault had been monitoring it since their first conversation, and in the spring she filed a formal observation report with the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority documenting measurable substrate loss on the island's northern and western faces, correlated with changes in sediment transport pattern downstream of the Harden Channel. The Maritime Authority commissioned a review. The lead engineer, a methodical woman named Ms. Fontenot, spent 3 weeks in the field before she came to Earl's house. She sat at the same kitchen table with the same notebooks. She spent a long time with his father's 1964 entry, the bar shift, the pelican movement, the self-correction, and then at Earl's records from 2 years before construction. The migration cycle isn't a historical record, she said. It's in your notebooks. It's not in our model, because our model didn't use your notebooks. The review would recommend a modified revetment design, not removal of the hardening, which was no longer feasible, but controlled sediment outlets that would attempt to mimic the pass's natural cycling artificially. Not the same as a living system. Better than nothing. She asked about the pelican data. Earl showed her Marcus's green notebook. She looked at the boy's handwriting, careful, column organized, dated every Saturday, and then at Earl's entries from the same days. She said, "How old is he?" Earl said, 10. He'll be 11 in March. She asked if she could copy both notebooks for federal wildlife file. Earl said yes. Then he said, "His name goes on it, if it goes anywhere official, his and my father's." She said she would make certain of that. In the spring of the third year, a federal wildlife biologist arrived on the island with a survey team. They found 41 pairs on the eastern face, 3 on the western. The western substrate had eroded past the point of stable nesting. The migration was complete and permanent. Earl watched from the shore. Marcus was with him. It was a Saturday. The boy counted without being asked and wrote in his notebook. Then he looked up and said, "They're not coming back to the western side, are they?" Earl said, "Not this season." Marcus wrote something. Earl didn't look at what it was. The modified revetment design was approved that summer. Sediment outlets, engineered gaps in the armor allowing control material exchange with the adjacent wetland system, were scheduled for installation the following year. Dr. Arsenault had told Earl the outlets would not restore the full cycle, but they would slow the wetland decline measurably. Not a reversal, a slowing. It was what was possible. Earl could live with possible. He had spent 34 years making the best call with what the past was telling him. Possible was something you could work with. That October, Earl received a letter from his Fontenot's firm enclosing the final engineering review report. He turned to the appendix. Appendix C, historical observation data and baseline records. The first source listed, Duchamp family piloting logs, Calcasieu Pass, 1961, present. Primary documentation of decadal bar migration cycle and associated biological indicators. His father's name, Edmond Duchamp, 1961 to 1988. His own name below it, and in the biological data section, under colonial nesting bird baseline. Pelican count records, 2019, present. Compiled by Marcus Duchamp, age 10. Earl read his grandson's name in a federal engineering document for a long time. He put the report in the wooden cabinet between his father's last notebook and his own. He closed the cabinet. He went to the porch. The past moved the way it had always moved, east and west and east again, patient and hydraulic, and indifferent to the drawings humans made of it, carrying its sediment in the pull of the current, dropping it in the places it had always dropped it, building the island the way it had always built the island when it was allowed to. The pelicans were on the eastern face. They had known before anyone else. They had simply been waiting for someone to count them.